Hello, and welcome to the Alexander Society. This podcast is all about the two things that the sport of football has in spades, and that is history and drinking. I'm your host, catching drunken disorderly charges after my fighting Texas Aggies win in triple overtime, baby! Let's fucking go! I'm Derek, joined by my friend and co-host, that one guy in the marching band that spent the whole game on his phone, Tim. How you doing, Tim?
I fucking hate how accurate that is.
Let's fucking go, baby.
I don't know how you convinced me to let you do a sports topic, but hey ho, we're here.
Yeah, I think that you're actually going to get a bit. I think I've done an adequate job to give you something that at least it will come off as a good story even to somebody who's not familiar with football.
We had just done our introduction. What are you drinking tonight, brother?
Oh, what am I drinking tonight? So for sipper, I went with something, American. So while we talk about our American sport, a good tailgating beer, I've got Co-op Ale Works, Oklahoma City local, Co-op 66 Lager. Just a good old-fashioned, regular American lager.
Is it everyone's turn to release, like, a good Coors or good Bud Light? Because I think Neff just released of basically the same thing.
Yeah, I'm not complaining about it. Light lagers deserve their day in the sun, too. Okay, yeah, so it is Co-op 66 Lager, Co-op Ale Works, and it is 4.5%. It's just an American lager. Nothing special, nothing fancy, just a tailgate beer. And it's actually good, unlike Coors or Budweiser. And then for my shots, I'm pulling out an old favorite, the White Spring Spirits Femme Fatale Raspberry Vodka, 40%. Tastes like actual fruit. Pretty good. I like it. Tim, what are you drinking?
So tonight, I am drinking Hawaiian TKO by Prairie, but I'm looking at it may be a collaboration because it's showing brewed and packaged by Krebs Brewing Company, McAllister, Oklahoma, as well underneath it. Like it's got a big, it's not like I'm just thinking it's Prairie. There's a big Prairie Artisan Ales brand on to it. It's a sour ale with pineapple, strawberry, and tangerine. Basically, it's supposed to be a sour beer version of Hawaiian Punch, and it tastes exactly like that. It's amazing. And it's 5.4%.
That's respectable. That's a respectable amount.
Yeah, it's pretty good. And then I thought a great combination with that would have been the bamboo that I have. So I just got a little bit left. I'm trying to find its percentage, but I don't remember where it's at. It's on the gold part. It's 35%. So, Derek, we have an ever-changing set of rules in this illustrious society. What is the first rule for this week?
Yes, here in our illustrious sporting society, rule number 1, every time our guy has a winning season, we're going to take a sip.
Rule number 2, every time our guy moves to a different school, we're going to take 3 sips.
And rule number 3, every time I say some crazy shit,
we're going to take a motherfucking shot.
I'm going to take a motherfucking shot. Prost.
Cheers.
So, Tim, what do you know about football?
Quite a bit, considering I grew up playing middle school, high school football. I'm not a big fan of it. I know the intricacies. I'm not well versed enough to truly appreciate a lot of special plays, but I knew the general rules.
Yeah, you're more of a know about football because you're culturally exposed to it. And
yeah,
I suppose I'm not huge into football. I'll watch on occasion. I'm mainly interested in sometimes just going through stats and play-by-plays, and then especially just the history of the sport is fascinating. I love sports history, and it's nice to read about sports history and take a break from other kinds of history like politics and war and stuff like that. It's just nice to read about a guy who came up with a bunch of cool plays and has a bunch of funny stories about his various away games and things like that. It's so much fun. It's very low stakes. It's very relaxing, and this is one of my favorite guys in that sort of area. This guy is not really, I wouldn't say irrelevant outside of football, but within football, he's so overshadowing that it kind of sucks up all the air in the room for everything else. The legacy that he left on the game of American football, like, there were probably like two other guys that were as influential on the modern game of American football than this guy, and both of them were alive at the same time and were.
Who were the other two?
Oh shit! What were their names? Fuck, they got really fun names. Hold on. Okay, yeah, Pop Warner and Walter Camp were two other guys that were like instrumental in creating the rules.
I feel like I've heard of Pop Warner, but no, not the other.
Also, Amos Stagg. Yeah, they were all like players and coaches in like the 1880s, 1890s through like the 1920s.
Ah, so quick question. Was that Twitter rant because you found out more about the football because of this episode? Is that how you knew all that knowledge?
Yeah. Yeah, when I found out, I was fucking furious at the English. The English have been shitting on American football for so goddamn long. And here I come learning about this topic, reading more about it, and come to find out the reason that we call American football football and the reason that we call soccer soccer and not football
is because that's what they were called when we got introduced.
Is because that's the names that they gave the sports when they brought them over to the. Fuck you, English people. I hate you so much. I hate you so much, you pretentious fucking assholes. American gridiron football is one of the greatest sports on the face of the planet. Association rules football can go fuck itself. Fuck all of you.
I'm kind of surprised that we didn't change its name, because America likes to just co-op things and just rebadge them as their own. And I'm surprised they didn't say, no, fuck you, this is now egg ball or whatever the fuck.
Yeah, hand egg. Before we get into our guy is John Heisman, by the way.
From the Heisman Trophy infamy.
I don't know if I mentioned that before for our listeners, but yeah, from Heisman Trophy fame. I guess infamy too. There were a lot of bad people that got the Heisman, but
I don't have a negative connotation. It's neutral for me, so
yeah, it's not a bad the Heisman. I'm not going to come here and moralize about the Heisman Trophy because some Heisman winners ended up being bad people.
There's been plenty of bad people out there in both sports, as two of our favorite podcasters would not have gotten a start if it weren't for criminal athletes.
Yeah, so before we talk about John Heisman, though, let's talk about where we get football from.
Oh, you're going to explain that to the audience?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting story. So, throughout most of European history, we've had accounts of different types of sports that are played with balls.
This man plays with balls.
Yeah, this man. Chat, point and laugh at this man. He plays with balls. In the Roman Empire, there was a popular amateur street ball game called harpastum, which was played with a ball made of pig hide and filled with feathers. And we're not sure precisely on the rules of the game, but we know that the basics was that you scored points based on the amount of time that you were able to keep the ball on your opponent's side of the court, and that you scored extra points when you had a goal, and whoever had the most points at the end would win. Forms of that game and other like similar games spread throughout the Roman Empire as it expanded, and so the games like that just ended up all over the Mediterranean. And besides that, playing games with balls made from some sort of animal hide is something that's kind of universal throughout.
Oh no, like that general description has been around for probably centuries, if not millennia.
Yeah, but the specific kind of like in Europe, ball games like this have a very sort of like endurance element to them. Like there's a big part of the game that centers around like keeping the ball away from your opponents for as long as possible, and it involves being very active for a very long amount of time, whereas games in other parts of the world might emphasize more like a like physical confrontation or like accuracy with like shooting the balls and like the agility they're required to handle the ball in specific ways. But in Europe, it's specifically keep this ball in a certain state for as long as possible. And that was the general idea that eventually led to the formation of football, because these types of games spread with the Roman Empire and kind of got cemented all throughout different parts of Europe. Specifically, they lasted the longest in places like northern Italy, where to this day a form of harpestum is still played as like a cultural heritage thing. And it also stuck around in the British Isles and kind of expanded and evolved into its own thing throughout the Middle Ages. And so throughout the Middle Ages, all through the British Isles, you get a bunch of accounts of different sports that are being played with kind of these same things, whether it's kicking the ball around trying to get them into nets, or if it's like carrying the ball trying to push other people away to keep you from being brought down, something like that. And every language that they appear in, it is in some way, in some linguistic shape or form, it always carries a similar name. It's some form of foot and ball.
So you're saying neither association football or soccer or whatever you want to call it and our football are nowhere near the first two to ever been called themselves football?
Absolutely not. No, we have accounts of people calling different sports football all the way back to like 1000 at the very latest, and it's just always been a thing. You always, like, if you have a sport that you play with a ball, you call it football. For no idea why, but that's just how it kind of ended up shaping out. As Britain entered into its imperial chapter of history, like the mid to late 1700s, the early 1800s. A lot of these games that were kind of more the purview of, the poor peasantry, maybe the working class, they kind of started to percolate up into like the middle and the upper classes as well. And so you started seeing a lot of these games being played in America, we'd call them private schools, but in Britain they're called public schools.
What?
Yeah, they're called public schools because even though you have to pay to go to them, they're technically more open than other schools that came before them, because anybody could go regardless of whether they were nobility or not. And so technically speaking, they were open to the public as long as you could pay.
I feel like it'd be more accurate to call them boarding schools then. I mean, I know not every school like that is a boarding school, but like...
Well, they are still called boarding schools. Public schools are a particular type of boarding school.
That's just so dumb to me.
Yeah, specifically in general for like middle class kids, like the kids who may not, in England particularly, whose families may not necessarily have a noble title but are still rich, either from like business or military service, whatever. So we start getting examples of games like what would eventually become in the broad umbrella of football, played in different boarding schools for like middle and upper class kids throughout England. Specifically, the earliest known use of the term football to refer to a particular specific sport comes to us in 1803, and it referred to a game that students were playing at a school in Warwickshire called rugby school. And this form of football, it resembled very closely like modern rugby, because that is where rugby gets the name.
See, I didn't know all three had the same origin of sport of origin. I would have thought rugby would have came from a different root sport.
Yes, rugby was the original football. It is what they called football before soccer and American football were a thing. So yeah, that form of football more closely resembled modern rugby. And the first, quote-unquote college football team was formed at Cambridge University in 1840 by an alumni of rugby school named Albert Pell. And again, this is vaguely related, like a precursor to modern American football, also a precursor to modern soccer or European football, whatever. In 1845, players at rugby school, or players who were who were alumni of rugby school, who were at college by that point. They developed the first written set of rules for football, which started to become the standard for players throughout the country. And many amateur clubs came together and formed the Football Association in order to enforce some structure to the sport. However, some of the clubs in the Football Association, specifically Barnes FC, which is considered like one of the oldest and greatest football clubs in England, they thought that the rugby school's rules were too boorish and brutal for their sport because they're prissy Londoners. And so they introduced some new rules. The FA introduced new rules in 1863, which banned touching the ball with their hands. So they couldn't carry the ball anymore, which was a big part of the game at the time. And it also banned hacking, which is basically like... Hacking is basically when you kick the ball carrier's shins in order to like knock them. Like in rugby, instead of tackling like in American football, they have hacking, which is you're not trying to tackle the other player, or the ball carrier.
Trying to trip them, basically?
Yeah, you're trying to trip them.
Interesting.
So some of the clubs in the FA were peeved about these prissy Londoners who were shitting all over their good rugby rules. And so they left the FA and formed the Rugby Football Union in 1871. The rule set that was adopted by the Football Association came to be called Association Football, and which is sometimes referred to by the slang term soccer. The teams that left the FA referred to their sport as Rugby Union Football, which today is just called rugby. So, that was around 1863, 1871. Let's back up a few years.
That's a lot more recent than I would have thought the evolution of football to be.
Yeah, it happened like... I was about to say it doesn't seem like that long, and then I said... And then I realized I was about to say it's only been like 150 years, and I realized, when I put it in those terms, it actually seems like a lot older than I really thought. I don't know, words are weird.
Time is weird. Timely, wimely, bobbly, boobly.
Yeah, when I say 1871, I think, that was relatively recent in the grand scheme of things. But if I say 150 years ago, that's like, wow, that's a fucking long time. So while all of that was going on in England, many rugby football players were starting to move to North America, specifically to Canada, and they were bringing their sport along with them. And, well, I guess I should say, rugby arrived first. Rugby arrived to North America first by way of Canada. Soccer arrived later by way of like American universities, specifically in New England. So places like Harvard and Yale were the first to adopt association football rules in North America, whereas up in Canada is where they first adopted like rugby rules. And that's where the first instances of what would eventually become gridiron football or American style football first emerged, was like places like University of Montreal and the University of Toronto. Which is really interesting because because the South is so dominant in football today, you'd think that it would have come from the other direction, that it would have started in the South and moved its way north. But it's the other direction. It started in Canada and then moved its way south.
Honestly, with stuff like originating stuff like that, nothing really phases me on stuff like that, to be honest. Like,
yeah, I feel you. I guess,
like, location of origin, because I get, like, I'm usually wrong on guesses like that shit, so I'm just like, okay, it doesn't faze me.
Yeah, and I guess this whole story is, part of this story is how football became so big in the South, because it had a lot to do with this one guy. So strap in for that.
Buckle up, motherfuckers, we're going for a ride.
So, as the sport sort of percolated through North American colleges and universities, they started to adopt their own distinct rules because it was starting to evolve separately from the sport as it existed in England.
I feel like anytime you have a large divergence geographically like that, there's going to be divergence on how you play it. Just like...
specifically, one of the big early changes they made when it got to North America was the rugby that was played in Canada. They adopted this rule where they would play the game on a field that was painted in like a grid pattern. So it didn't just have like yard lines; it had lines going the other direction too. So it was it formed squares.
Weird. Is that where our hash marks came, like, are still a remnant of, I guess?
Yeah, hash marks are kind of a relic of that. Just yard lines in general. Like eventually they got rid of the horizontal lines and just kept the vertical yard lines. But at the time, it was one of the rules that they developed, especially at the University of Toronto, was that whenever they ended a play, wherever the ball carrier went down, that grid square was where the ball would start on the next play.
That would be an interesting thing to have made it to today, because that would change a lot of plays.
Yeah, it wouldn't really work for today because the way that we play today, it's much more spread out across the entire field.
Of course,
Because you have like long passes are a big part of the sport nowadays. Another thing that we're going to talk about the origins of that in this story, but the whole game, like the game as it was played back then, the most important players at the time were the linemen, the guys like right up front, and so all of the action revolved right around them because it was just a running game. The only passes you had were short laterals. It was never so you never had a need to have guys who were way out on the wings because that meant you had less guys in the center pushing holes open for the ball carrier, and so it wouldn't really work as well today.
could you imagine if someone went back to the origin of football and started throwing strats from today?
It was some people tried that early on in rugby's history and it just never caught on because everybody it took away from the physicality of the game, which was a big appeal to it. They thought it was a very masculine game because of the physicality, and they thought that throwing the ball took some of that physicality away. So it would be fun just to watch people's reaction, especially if you took like a modern like NFL quarterback.
I imagine if you took like a modern coach and threw him back in time, they would just be running circles around some of the old shit.
Oh my God! You take like Nick Saban from today, and you dropped him in like a gridiron scrimmage in like 1885 or something. God, he would wipe the floor. He'd have to adjust to the well. In this scenario, would we be doing like modern day football rules so that Saban would know, or would we be doing rules back then?
I would say we'd be playing by the old rules. They would just be using, because you can't get the what I'm thinking of is plumping a modern coach as the coach. That's all. Just the coach shows up, it's like, okay, you're going to run these strats. That's it.
Yeah, and it was a very fluid game. The rules were very fluid back then, so somebody would see those rules and be like, hell yeah, let's do that. So yeah, that style of using like a grid pattern on the field is where we get the term gridiron from. That's why American football is referred to as gridiron football.
I have literally never heard us call it gridiron football.
I've heard it.
That's me as a Yank / Americaner who I was most of the way growing up before I knew there was another football sport. Like I was in my late teens before I knew that soccer was also called football.
And now you're learning rugby is also called football.
My world has come crashing down around me, Derek.
American football, soccer, and rugby are all the same sport, but they're just different breeds of the same sport.
It's a different translation.
It's like a Chihuahua versus like a German Shepherd. Technically, they're both dogs. They're just different breeds. So the first, what would eventually become American football game, using like those old rugby rules that eventually became American football rules. It was first played at the University of Toronto in November of 1861. That was the first American football game in North America. By the end of the 1860s, several American schools had formed their own clubs, and they were playing against each other. But at that time, the American schools were using association rules rather than rugby rules. So technically, they were playing soccer. It wasn't like modern American football. That changed after a couple games were played between McGill University in Montreal and Harvard University. The Harvard players liked the rugby rules so much more than the soccer rules that they ended up just adopting those rules and using them instead. And what's considered to be the very first gridiron college football game in American history was played between Harvard and Yale in 1875, which is
Those rich fucks.
yeah, those rich fucks, which is still to this day a lot like a lasting football rivalry that is still like
I'm not surprised. Like there's a lot of just useless rivalries.
yeah. So that after that first game, Yale was still. They actually played two games. They played one using the rugby rules and one using the association rules. And both Harvard and Yale agreed the rugby rules were way better. They liked it a lot more. And so
That's a lot more fun. I get to fuck people up.
with the first two powerhouse football programs in the country adopting rugby rules, pretty much every other rule like school started to adopt rugby rules with them. And that's how we get the proliferation of American college football as it would eventually become. Now, I said Harvard and Yale 1875 was the first gridiron game. It's sometimes not. There's sometimes another game that's credited as being the first American intercollegiate football game, and that is the game between Princeton and Rutgers in 1869. But there's some debate about whether that should be considered the first because they played with association rules. And so really it wasn't the first American football game, it was the first American soccer game.
Okay.
So yeah, I figured I'd throw that out there because I knew that's something that like
That's gonna be well actually.
yeah, so fuck you Princeton and Rutgers. I don't care about either of your programs. I don't even know who your mascots are. Let's back up a few years. Let's drop football for the moment. And let's talk about a fellow by the name of Johann Wilhelm Heisman, better known to history as John William Heisman.
Oh, so he has he's got a fancy name.
Yeah, we're talking about another German because I just can't do an episode of this show without talking about a German.
Funny enough, this episode I think is going to release at the beginning of October. Because Ho Chi Minh's going to be the 11th, Silk Road's going to be the 25th, then the 9th will be Heisman of October.
Hey, a great German American for our Oktoberfest.
Hey, we kind of accidentally did a German American for.
We accidentally stumbled into doing something correctly.
Yay!
So yes, John William Heisman was born in Cleveland, Ohio on October 23rd, 1869. He was the son of two immigrants from Bavaria in Germany. So yeah, a Bavarian American for our Oktoberfest episode. That's great. That worked out great.
That's hella convenient.
Even though he was born in Cleveland, he ended up growing up in Titusville, Pennsylvania, which is where the site of the very first oil boom in American history was.
Interesting.
Yep. And his John's dad, Michael Heisman, he was a cooper by trade, which a cooper is somebody who makes barrels.
I would not have assumed that is how it's pronounced. For like that, I wouldn't assume that's the word for a barrel maker.
Yeah, it's a cooper. Yeah, so he was a cooper, and he ran a coopering business in Cleveland. But a few years into the oil boom, he figured he might be able to make some good money if he went and made barrels for all of the oil companies in Titusville. And so he did way better than he ever expected to. They got to Titusville, and he got a contract as the sole provider of barrels for Standard Oil. Anyways, so yeah, Michael Heisman, he ended up getting a contract to become the sole barrel provider for Standard Oil.
How the fuck does one pull that off?
By just being, he had the ability to make the barrels that they needed while they were growing into like a big company, and Standard Oil needed a lot of barrels because they were pumping a lot of oil out of the ground. So It's just a confluence of the right the right forces at the right time made Michael a very wealthy individual. Also, Standard Oil, to give you an idea of like how rich Standard Oil and Michael was getting off of this, Standard Oil is the company that made John D. Rockefeller rich. So because Michael Heisman gets rich off of hitching his coopering business to Standard Oil, John doesn't. So they don't live rich. They are rich, but they don't live rich. Like they live in like a modest house and kind of live like a middle class lifestyle. Because Michael didn't really believe in like flaunting ostentatious wealth. So essentially, he grew up like culturally like kind of middle class. They were just extremely financially stable.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, so he had a stable upbringing, but like he didn't like go to private schools or anything. He went to a public school and like lived with like other kids, like spent time with other kids in the neighborhood. He was essentially just a regular everyday person. His dad's bank account just happened to have like six figures, which at the time today that would be like 7-8 figures. Yeah.
7 or 8.
So from an early age, he was the middle child. His parents had three. He had two brothers, an older brother and a younger brother. And all three of them were passionate football players from a very young age. Though at the time when they were playing association rules because that's what had kind of percolated into the U.S. first. And so when they played football as kids, they were essentially playing like proto-soccer.
Okay.
But he was passionate about football. John loved football. He spent all his time not just playing football, but just thinking about football. He was constantly like strategizing, and he very much was kind of like a tactician. He was like the Napoleon of football. And it comes out all the time. Like he's just like not just a very like strong athletic player, but he was also like a very strategic player. He came up with a lot of like clever ways to play that other players wouldn't think of, and that's what part of what made him a really good player, but also made him an extremely good coach later on. And that was something that was very obvious even from like an early age. His dad did not like his kids playing football because he thought that the sport was too brutish, thought it was too violent. Which is really funny thinking about like modern soccer, but at the time, like they were kicking people, they were punching people. It was violent, like coming out of a football game with like bruises all over your body and sometimes like a broken nose or something. It was not uncommon. Like that was just a regular part of the sport. So he was passionate about football, but he was also, this is really interesting. He was really into theater.
I mean, who doesn't love the arts?
He was that rare theater kid who was also on the football team.
I mean, I had a cousin who was like he was like several years older. He was like one of the football like stars, and his coach tried to make him only play football, but he was also one of the drumline. And he's like, "Coach, if you try and make me pick, I will pick band. Don't try me." And oh, okay, he just dropped it.
Yeah, we had a sousaphone player in my high school band who was a football player. Did your guy also have to wear his football uniform when he marched halftime?
Yeah, he didn't have time to change.
So yeah, he was a theater kid. He loved Shakespeare. He adored Shakespeare. It was one of his favorite for his whole life. He was always an actor. Like he not just produced but also acted in plays and dramas his entire life. Not like musicals, but like comedies and tragedies, that kind of thing. And he loved Shakespeare. He would incorporate later on when he became a coach. He would incorporate Shakespeare into like his like game speeches, like pre-game speeches to his players and things like that. And he was such a good public speaker that it always kind of worked out. It was never like cringy or unnatural. It always came off like very earnest and was actually like, by all accounts, he was a very inspiring public speaker.
Nice.
Even like in high school, like everybody liked him. He was very popular. He was very well spoken, very charismatic. He was also kind of a little guy. He was a little short. He was around 5'6". Never his whole life he never got over about 160 pounds, which made it really interesting because in high school and in college he played a lineman. Specifically, he very often played either center or guard, but both back then and today, linemen usually have to be pretty big, pretty beefy to be good at yeah. I was a lineman. I played football for one season.
You were scrawny back then, though.
Back when? Because somewhere around there. I was kind of a because this was when I was in like 5th grade, so I was kind of a chunky kid, but yeah, I was a lineman. I was a right guard, and at the very least, I'm tall. Like I've got some. I'm tall and I'm kind of broad. Even if I'm kind of scrawny in the limbs, sometimes I'm a little broad. So, but he was short. He was well built. Like he was fit. He was muscular, but he was just small. He had a very small frame, but he still played lineman because he just had like a really effective dynamic athleticism that allowed him to kind of compensate for his small stature when he was facing up against at 160 pounds going up against guys that were like 210, 220. If he couldn't beat them with physical strength, he could beat them with brains. He could outthink them. He could move around. He ran circles around guys all the time playing O-line. And back then, linemen were way more important back then than they are now. They're like the big important part of the whole team. Like, because they were the guys who formed like the shield. The way that it was played back then was all of the linemen would kind of have to form a shield around the ball carrier in order to push through the defensive line and create like a pathway for the ball carrier to get through.
So like some of those scenes you see in movies, like, we're on the final yard line, push him out of the way, kind of thing.
Yeah, they kind of like, and this is something that is kind of against the rules of football today, but back then it was like the basic function of the game was you'd basically have your linemen form a phalanx around the ball carrier and kind of move them in like a bubble through like just a crowd of guys like trying to kick and punch their way through. That's basically how football was played back then. And that was for both rugby and association rules. So yeah, John, he graduated salutatorian from Titusville High School in 1887, and he ended up going to Brown University. He wanted to go to a university with a football team. He made a point of doing that. The unfortunate thing is, the day after he arrived on campus for his first semester at Brown disbanded their football team.
That is a cuck move.
Oh yeah, he was very upset by this development because he'd already sunk all his money to go to this school.
I'm counting moving from high school to college as one of the 3 steps, and then I'm assuming there's another one coming up.
Oh, it's gonna happen a lot. Yeah.
I know it's a cheap blow, but I'm fucking going for it.
Yeah, that's fine. That is your privilege as the rules commissioner. He couldn't play college ball, but there were some local clubs. Also, I forgot to mention this, but the day that he arrived at Brown University was literally like he got off the train, he walked to campus, and the first thing he sees is a bunch of freshmen playing a pickup game, like just a small scrimmage on like the polo field or something. And the second he arrives, he immediately jumps in and starts playing with them, and they're playing using rugby rules, or gridiron rules, which he had never been exposed to before. This was his first time. This was his first time seeing a ball shaped like an American football before. All the balls he'd played with as a kid were like round rubber balls, but the one that he was playing with here was like a pigskin, like an American style pigskin.
Okay.
With like the egg shape, and that was really interesting to him because for the big thing was a ball that's shaped like that. It doesn't roll predictably, and so that opens up a bunch of new ways for the game to get interesting. The second thing is that the quarterback on the team playing offense was doing play calls, which was a big no-no in association rules. You didn't do that.
How does that work?
Play calls are basically you speak in code. So if you ever listen to a quarterback in like an NFL game, it's like,
Oh, so what we do now.
yeah. So like blue 42, that kind of thing. The quarterback shouting that. That's like I forgot what the actual term for it is, but you're basically calling out like what you want your players to do using code. And so he heard that for the first time, and at first he was kind of put off by it. He thought it was like kind of cheap. That's kind of the way that like a lot of soccer players at the time kind of viewed it. It was just like a cheap way to like mess with your opponents. But the more that he kind of played with it, the more he realized, oh, this opens up a lot of opportunities for like really like tactical, strategic playing.
Yeah, that's why it's standard now.
Yeah, and that's why it's done. It's really neat. It's a really neat part of the game, actually. It's kind of one of those parts of the game that you don't really think about a lot, but then you look at the history and like, oh yeah, that is actually like a really interesting, important part of the story. Yeah, and I'm going to bring this up a lot, but this is a period of time when a lot of the stuff that we take for granted as part of the sport of football
weren't established.
Yeah, they were first being established, and they were first starting to become not taboo to do in the sport. So even though he couldn't play college football at Brown, he played for some like local football clubs, and got some experience under his belt. And then his junior year, he transferred to Penn to go to the law school there.
3 sips.
Yep. When he got to Penn had a football team, so he was finally able to play intercollegiate college football. And by all accounts, he was pretty good. He was a really solid center. He sometimes played right guard. He sometimes played left tackle. I think he tried playing end a few times, but he just didn't really have like he had mobility. He just didn't really have like the sort of like dynamic that you needed to play end at the time with the kind of job that they were doing, because they had to move like laterally a lot. But yeah, by all accounts, he was like a very good, very valued member of the team. He was also a brilliant student. Like one of those students that could have like a full football schedule and still find a way to make straight A's. He was one of those kids.
Like that's just getting straight A's is hard enough. Adding extracurriculars on top.
Yeah, and I don't think they didn't use like an A to F grading system back then. To give you an idea of like how good this guy was when he was a student, the grading scale that they used was on a range from 20 to 0, with 20 being like a perfect grade. The lowest grade that he ever made in any class was a 17.6, which was in geometry.
Damn.
Which essentially his lowest grade was like a B- or a C+.
Okay. I'm not going to even pretend to understand that grading system.
So at one game that he played in 1889, I believe, there was one incident while he was playing for Penn that almost cost him his entire, not just his football career, but his potential legal career as well.
Oh, damn.
This is so stupid. This is something that could only happen in the 1880s. He didn't actually get hurt while playing. What happened was Penn was playing a game against Rutgers in Madison Square Garden.
Okay.
And at the time, Madison Square Garden had a state-of-the-art overhead lighting system, like an early version of stadium lights. And the way that these lights work was that they were on a pulley system, where you would drop them down to the ground in order to do maintenance on them and to light them.
Okay.
And then you'd haul them on those pulleys back up to the roof so that they'd be down and illuminating the court or the field. one of them was down in the process of being lit while the teams were out on the field doing like pregame warm-ups. And during one of these warm-ups, a ball went flying out in past the end zone, and so John went to run and grab it. And as he came in to try to grab the ball, he came up right next to one of those stadium lights, which, if I remember correctly, use to fuel these stadium lights. It used some sort of mixture of like a really caustic form of kerosene that was in like gas form.
Okay.
It was like just really, really like it gave off fumes that were just horrifically bad for you.
Gotcha.
like today would be completely banned by the FDA, or not the FDA, the not oh shit the EPA. Yeah, the EP today completely banned by the EPA. Back then was just a standard thing you used to make big lights. And so as he was running past the stadium light that was on the ground, they were lighting it on to test it, make sure it was working. And so as he was passing it, it flashed in his face. So you know how bright stadium lights are. Imagine one of them flashing right into your face.
That would have been I'm surprised he didn't get blinded.
He was temporarily blinded. He couldn't see for about 10 minutes.
Only 10 minutes?
Only 10 minutes. Hold on. Hold your horses. Not only was it the light that like blinded him, but when it lit, it also shot out a bunch of those caustic fumes.
Probably affected his lungs.
It didn't get into his lungs. He didn't have any lung issues as far as I'm aware, but it did get into his eyes. And when I say it burned his retinas, I don't mean it like gave his retinas sunburn. I mean the gas literally got into his eyeballs and physically scarred his retinas. It was bad. And so after a few minutes sitting out, his eyesight started to return a little bit, but it was still extremely blurry. He was having a lot of trouble seeing. He could make out like vague shapes and colors, but he couldn't make out details. And so he just went on. He went on trucking, hoping that eventually it would just clear itself up. He got through the whole game, which Penn won, by the way, and their rewards for this, because this was like a big deal exhibition game, which is why it was at Madison Square. And so their reward for winning this game was all of the players got gold watches.
The fuck?
Yeah, it was kind of a fun detail. Yeah, football was the Wild West back then.
Evidently, shit.
But he got through the whole game. Apparently, he played decent. There wasn't any complaints about his playing. But he could barely see the entire time. And so the game was over. He figured, well, I'll go ahead and sleep it off in the hotel room. Hopefully my eyesight will be back by the time I wake up. He wakes up, it's still blurry. He figures, okay, well, I'll just go ahead and get on the train. We'll head back home, and hopefully by the time I get back to campus, my eyesight will be better. He gets on the train. They get back to campus. It's still not good. He's like, okay, well, I've got one more night. I can sleep it off. Hopefully it'll be better in the morning. He sleeps it off, or he goes to sleep. He wakes up in the morning. It's still blurry.
Fuck.
And he has to go to class. And so he thinks to himself, fuck. Because keep in mind, he's in law school. He needs 90% of his entire curriculum is just reading.
Yeah.
And he can't read now. He can navigate fine. Like, he can navigate around campus because he can still make out shapes. But he can't read. He can't see the words on the page. And so he had to find a way to kind of get around this. And so eventually what he came up with was he explained the situation to some of his friends in the law school, and he ended up forming a study group. And basically the study group was they would all go over their notes from lecture, and they would all explain the concepts of like what they were reading to him, like verbally. And so he just took in all of the information verbally and kept it in his head. And so he never missed out on any of the reading assignments. He just had to get it secondhand. And so he was still able to complete all of the coursework. And then at the end of the semester, he was still like partially blind by the end of the semester. He went through a whole semester like this. But by the end of the semester, he had to take his exams. And so he successfully argued to his law professors, who were all lawyers and were good at arguing back, that he should be allowed to take his exams orally.
He did that successfully.
Yes, he did that successfully. And they agreed, and he took his exams orally, and he passed. And then he did so the next semester. He went off for summer break, came back the next semester, still couldn't see. Did that again while also playing football. And then the next semester, he came back from winter break and did it all again.
Fucking what?
Yeah, his eyesight was half gone the entire time. He got through 3 semesters of law school this way, and he graduated.
Jesus fucking Christ.
That's crazy. That's crazy, isn't it? This guy was a fucking genius. Like, genuinely. Yeah,
This man's a legend. Take the football career out of it. That's fucking legendary.
yeah. The football on top of everything is just the cherry on top. Like,
For real.
man, he would have been a legendary lawyer if he'd ever actually done anything with his degree. Honestly, he's one of those guys where I think he probably would have become legendary in whatever field he decided to go into.
He would have been a legend in anything, yes.
Yeah. You think that was some crazy shit?
Getting through fucking college with basically blind?
Yeah.
Hell yes, it is crazy shit.
Prost.
Cheers.
He graduates law school, but at this point, he can't really become a lawyer because he can't see words on a page, and a huge part of a lawyer's job is reading.
Filing briefs and shit.
Yeah, so his doctors basically tell him, yeah, you gotta take a break from using your eyes for a little while to let them heal. Like, trying to read or anything would be really bad for them. And so he holds off on doing law for a little bit, and he's trying to figure out what to do with his life. He briefly spent some time as a door-to-door kitchenware salesman, basically selling silverware and stuff. He hates the job, he hates doing it, and also he can't do it long. He ends up not being able to do it for a little bit because while he's at that job, the panic of 1893 hits and the country goes into a depression.
Fun.
And so he can't find customers anymore. So he's kind of listless. He doesn't really know what to do. And a little part of his brain still doesn't really want to be a lawyer. And of course, the big thing about all this is he really misses football. He really misses that he can't just keep playing football or keep being involved in football. And so when a notice went out that a college football team was looking for a head coach, he decided to go ahead and apply. And this was Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio. So he hopped on a train and he went out to Oberlin, Ohio, and he did a quick interview with the athletic association, some representatives from the athletic, which back then athletic directors, yeah, I guess that's the term, athletic directors, and athletic departments at these schools were all student run.
Interesting.
Yeah, they weren't officially part of the school administrations yet. That would change later when college athletics actually starts making money. That's when the administration gets involved directly.
This is a new school, 3 sips.
Yeah, it was 3 sips. So yeah, he goes and he applies, and they'd been having trouble finding a head coach because they couldn't really afford to pay a head coach.
Of course.
Yeah, they didn't have any money to pay him, so he wasn't getting paid.
Fucking what?
And so he was kind of hesitant to actually take it because he did need money. But what they offered him instead was, well, while you're coaching here, you can also enroll in our graduate school for free.
Free graduate school is pretty good damn deal.
Yeah, it was fucking rocked, but especially rocked for him, not because he wanted a graduate degree. In fact, once he took this, he never attended a single class. But because he was officially enrolled as a student, by the rules,
he could play again.
He could play even while he was head coaching. And so that's what he did. He came to Oberlin, he coached, and he continued to play. He was 22 years old.
Could you imagine someone trying to pull that bullshit now?
Oh man, I love old sports stories like this because finding out the way that it functioned before everything was super corporatized is so funny.
This is hilarious.
Yeah, trying to imagine a college athlete doing any of this shit today is so off the walls that
there'd be public outcry. Head coach, hey, I'm enrolling in graduate studies while being the coach. I'm going to be a student again. But I think they've actually made it where that wouldn't happen anyway because your eligibility is based by your undergrad degree, not your post-grad.
Yeah, I think it's based on undergrad, but if you have less than 4 years of play time when you graduate, if you're in grad school, then you can still play whatever the number of years after that is. So if it's like your first year of grad school and you had 3 years of playing in your undergrad, then you can still play a fourth year as graduates.
That's weird.
Yeah, it's
I still feel like there's probably a carve out that says, hey, the head coach can't be a player.
yeah, I'm sure that's somewhere because that was actually really common back then because it was such a young sport that a lot of the head coaches and things like that were themselves like just college students like a year prior. So yeah, he goes and he coaches at Oberlin. He plays with the team, and that season, 1892, the Oberlin team goes 7-0.
Damn.
They have an undefeated season. 5 of those games they weren't scored on. He goes 7-0 this season. With 5 of those games, nobody scored on Oberlin.
What?
Yeah, 5 of those games ended with like a number -0 with an Oberlin win.
Goddamn.
Now, I'm going to full-throatedly support Oberlin in this and say that they did have an undefeated season this year. But that is up for debate by some people, specifically people from the University of Michigan, because their last game of the season was against Michigan, who were the powerhouse team in the Midwest at the time. And at this last game, it was played on a Saturday. And part of the rules for being enrolled at Oberlin was that you had to attend morning chapel on Sunday. And so they had to finish the game with enough time to be able to catch a train back to Oberlin so that they could be at chapel the next morning.
That's lame.
Yeah, that's religious schools. There's Christian private schools still do that.
I'm so glad I did not have to go to a religious college. I probably would have fucking killed myself. I don't mean that as like, oh, depressive or as a joke. Like, I legit think I would have like been in such a bad mindset at a religious college that I wouldn't have thought to drop out. I just would have said end it.
Although you could have learned about the magical world of soaking.
That is the what? I thought someone was fucking with me when they first explained soaking to me. Then then I found out it was a real fucking thing Mormons did. I'm like, the fuck?
Yeah, okay. I don't think that's really fair because soaking is a Mormon thing at BYU and Oberlin is a Presbyterian school, so I guess they probably have their own weird shit. I don't think it's soaking though.
I'm just baffled that soaking is an actual thing that exists and is practiced.
I don't know, man. Mormonism does weird thing to people's heads.
Mormonism is a cult.
Yeah, it's like...
It fits all the criteria for a cult.
Well, so do a lot of major religions, like...
My point exactly.
Which is fine, but like I think it's a fair description between like something like Branch Davidian and like the whole Mormon Church. I think there are ways that
there's lowercase cults and there's capital case cults.
I just think that there are certain like types of like methods of control that are involved in a smaller insular cult that just isn't possible with like a large institution like the Mormon Church.
That's what I meant by like lowercase c cults, up capital case C cults.
Yeah, but yeah, so that last game of the 1892 season is disputed because the Oberlin players needed to make it back to Ohio to be able to make chapel the next morning, and so the two team captains got together before the game, and they agreed that whatever time was still on the clock, they would call the game at 4:50 p.m.
Sounds like someone was just a sore loser.
Yeah, I'll get to that. So that game ended up being a pretty close game for most of the playtime. And so when it finally reached 4:50 with 2 minutes left to go before the clock hit 4:50, Oberlin was able to pull out a touchdown and an extra point, which put them just over. And so after that, when the clock finally hit 4:50, their time caller, because at the time both teams had time callers who would like basically just watch the the timer and keep track of like play time and things like that. So the Oberlin time caller called the game at 4:50 for Oberlin, who had gotten like 20. They'd gotten the score up to 26-22 or something like that, and so Oberlin and Heisman, they cheer, they go off the field, they're celebrating, and they head back to their hotel so that they can shower and change so that they can make their train. Well, after they leave the field, all of the Michigan players the captain on the Michigan team decides, hey, that's not really fair because they had some delay of game penalties earlier in the game, and so we should rightfully have like a few more minutes because of their delay of game penalties. And so the ref, who was a fan of the University of Michigan, said, yeah, that makes sense. Let's go ahead and keep the clock running.
You can't keep the clock running after you've already called the game.
Well, the time caller from Oberlin called the game, but the time caller from Michigan didn't call the game.
Fuck off.
And so without Oberlin actually physically being there at all and not aware that this was happening, Michigan lined up on the line to play one more play. They received the ball, and then the quarterback just casually walked into the end zone. And so the Michigan time caller called the game officially as a Michigan victory.
Don't give me that bullshit. That's very clearly, hey, we've agreed this game is over already.
Yeah, it is actual horseshit. It is genuine horseshit. Fuck you, Wolverines. I don't care. You didn't beat John Heisman.
I don't give a shit about football in general unless it's like someone I have a vested interest in winning. Like, hey, local hometown team. To that extent, college. I grew up 30 minutes from Stillwater. I kind of want to see OSU win. Or, hey, OU's playing and they're not playing OSU. Kind of hope OU wins. I'm not going to really watch the game, but that's who I want to win. Those are the only three teams I give a shit about.
Yeah, I'm a Texas A&M fan. I have to cut down like perennial superpower schools whenever I get the chance. Because if I don't have anything. Imagine being a fan of a team that has the absolute recruiting potential to be able to become like consistent like national champions like Clemson or Ohio State or Alabama, and then just never doing it. That is what it feels like to be me.
Sounds like a personal problem.
That's why I don't spend a lot of time thinking about football. It's because when I do think about football, I get fucking sad. So yeah, so John, he ends the 1892 season at Oberlin 7-0 and has overnight transformed this football program into one of the big names in the Midwest. Basically, overnight, they became one of the big contenders outside of like the Ivy League for football programs. But he wasn't getting paid for it. And he kind of needed money. And so after that season, another college came to him and offered him a position that was actually paying. And this was Bechtel College in Akron, Ohio. And so he ended up going to Bechtel College. While he was there for a year, the 1893 season. He ended with a 5-2 record for that season. And while he was there, he accidentally invented the snap.
What the fuck do you mean by that?
So at the time, the way that the center snapped the ball, it wasn't even a snap. It was he put the ball on the ground and he pawed it so that it rolled back in the direction of the quarterback. And the quarterback...
The actual fuck?
Yeah, and then the quarterback had to lean over and pick it and scoop it up and then run whatever play he was doing. The problem was when he got to Bechtel, while he was at Bechtel, he was also the baseball coach. So he was coaching football, and he'd coach football in the fall, baseball in the spring. That was a pretty common thing, like for a coach to multitask like that.
Yet he's still not getting paid?
No, he was getting paid here. He was actually making like a decent salary for the time.
Oh, wow.
He made is he had a contract for 1 year and he was paid $900.
Which I'm imagining is decent for the time.
Yeah, back then it's like a comfortable like 80 grand, something like that. But yeah, he so when he first got to Bechtel and he was trying to build his team, none of the players that came out to try out for the team tried out for the position of quarterback. And so he needed a quarterback. So he offered the position to one of his baseball players who hadn't played football before, his star pitcher. The problem was he was really athletic. He was really dynamic. He was actually like, once he got the ball in his hands, he was actually really good at the position. And he showed a lot of promise. The problem was whenever the center would throw the ball back to him, he was 6'4" and half of that height was just his legs.
Fuck.
And so watching him, and so whenever he bent over to try to scoop the ball up, it looked like a modern art exhibit the way that he had to fold himself.
And I imagine that put more pressure on his guard and his linemen in general to keep the people away.
Oh yeah, that's why guard and tackle had to be such dynamic positions at the time. Part of why linemen were so important, because it took, compared to like the way that snaps work now, getting the ball into the hands of the quarterback at the time was a slow process. It took a lot more time relatively to actually physically get the ball in the quarterback's hand. And so it was all the more important.
I want to see shit like this applied to modern football. They make one of the teams just innovates so fucking hard, but it's not anywhere in the rules saying they can't do it, so they have to let him. And I just want to see that.
Yeah, that'd be great. The problem is we're in the era of like micromanaged scientific football, which has its it has its ups and its downs.
We're not likely to see it ever again, but I really would love to have seen that. Like, I would probably actually be a football fan if we had that.
Yeah, and fun fact, micromanaging scientific approach to football was invented by John Heisman.
God damn it.
Yeah. So his quarterback, this tall, lanky dude, he had to find a way to get the ball into his hands faster. And so basically, John just walked up to his center and was like, hey, instead of rolling it, just kind of throw it up. Just make sure to throw it up. And so he
just randomly came up with that idea.
Instead of rolling it back to him, just throw it straight towards him. And so they ran it a few times because that's not a skill that you just immediately know how to do.
No, snapping the ball is actually a lot fucking harder than you would think.
Oh, it's so fucking hard. Oh my god, it's so difficult. So yeah, he went up and he basically told his center, throw it up. Don't just roll it on the ground. Throw it up towards him. And so they workshopped it a little bit. He eventually was able to do it consistently. And after that, this random guy they pulled off the baseball team became the star player. So yeah, that was a 5-2 season. That was pretty solid. And then the next season, basically what happened was after he left Oberlin, he left behind a team that was so dominant that they were able to start making money off ticket sales. And so suddenly their athletic department had money to be able to pay him.
Yay!
And so they offered him a raise over what he was making at Bechtel to come back to Oberlin. And so he went back for the 1894 season.
Was that a school transfer? I didn't realize. So would that be 6 sips? Because I don't remember.
Well, yeah, he started at Oberlin in 1892. Then in 1893 he went to Bechtel because they actually offered to pay him.
Yeah, so that's 6 sips because I did not get you sips for the coaching transfer.
So yeah, he left Bechtel and he went back to Oberlin. The 1894 season, he had 4 wins, 3 losses, and 1 tie, which was, it was not as good as his first season at Oberlin, but his team was kind of suffering because most of their best players had graduated in the 2 years in the year that since he got back, or the year since he'd been gone. So it was, it was respectable. It was respectable for like the team mostly made up of freshmen that he was kind of dealing with that season. Yeah, so she wasn't just like attractive or they got along really well, but specifically she really liked football. She really liked going to football games. She really liked cheering on Heisman and cheering on his team. He could look up into the stands at a game and consistently see Edith up there cheering them on and enjoying the game. And, you know, woman after our own hearts.
I mean, that'll get any guy bricked up. Like a woman who's actually interested in one of your special interests. Fuck yes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I could attest to that firsthand. So, so they started dating early in 1894. They were engaged by the spring of 1894, and then sometime during the fall of 1894, Edith got sick, and it started out as something that looked like just a simple cold, but then she just kept getting worse and worse and worse until eventually she was bedridden. And Edith's mother called a doctor, and the doctor came out and diagnosed her with tuberculosis. Yes, Miss Edith Cole. She is diagnosed with tuberculosis, and the doctors say it is fatal and it will kill her. And so John tells her that he doesn't care if she's going to die. He wants to marry her, and he wants to marry her soon. But she refuses. She doesn't want to marry him because she doesn't want to burden him with being a widower.
I mean, I'm pretty sure he knows what he's getting into. I understand social implications back in the day, but still, if he goes in there knowing that's what's going to happen and he still wants to marry her, fuck it, give him what he wants. Like, especially if you do love him, if you agreed to get engaged with him, like, why wouldn't you?
Shut the fuck up. Edith just insisted that she released him from his promise of marriage when he proposed, because she basically said, like, we're not going to get married because I'm not going to burden you with all of the social baggage that comes with being a widower. Like, that's a big deal, and I'm not going to put that on you. But he absolutely refused. Every single day he'd come to visit her, and every time he would say, yeah, we are going to be married. And he would try to convince her. And he just got more and more intense with it. And eventually it got to the point, it became overwhelming. And Edith's mother basically had to take him aside and say,
fuck off.
More diplomatic with that. She basically said,
well, I figure, but you can still translate it to modern, just fuck off.
She did say fuck off, yes. Basically told him, it's sweet what you're doing, but it's becoming too much. You need to say your goodbyes now and then leave and never come back. And so reluctantly, that is what he did. He went and he said his final goodbyes to Edith, and then he left and didn't speak to her again. And so, yeah, that really fucked him up. He couldn't stand to live. He had to leave the state because everything in the state of Ohio just reminded him of her. And he wanted to distance himself from football because he just couldn't tolerate, because she would come to games and she would cheer him on, and that's how he really knew her. He knew her as the woman who came to support his passions and his ambitions as a football coach. And he couldn't stand to be around football anymore because it just reminded him of her. This thing that he loved so much. And so he resigned from his position at Oberlin College, and he decided to, what's like the conservative version of a hippie?
A hippie.
Homesteader. That's the term I'm looking for, a homesteader. He decides to go out and become a homesteader. He invests all his money in a tomato farm in Marshall, Texas. And he tries to go at it as a farmer. And as it turns out, tomatoes aren't native to Texas and don't grow well there. And so all of his savings that he sank into this tomato farm ended up drying up in the Texas sun.
As is normal.
And so he went from one of the most prominent up and coming coaches in college football to a poor, destitute tomato farmer in a matter of months. And that is when, while he was working on his new farm in the middle of the day, trying to salvage whatever tomatoes he could, he was approached by a man by the name. Oh, fuck, what was his name? He was the athletic director at Alabama Polytechnic Institute, and which Alabama Polytechnic is today Auburn University.
Okay.
So the athletic director at Auburn came to him on his farm, walked up, saw how his tomatoes were doing, and was like, "Hey, you need a job?"
Ooh. How big of like a fuck you would that have been? That's a big fuck you.
No, okay. I'm really overstating it. He was very he made a
No, I don't mean that literally. I mean that in the sarcastic manner.
yeah, it was implied through the conversation, but he made a point of not pointing out how poorly Heisman's farming venture was going. And Heisman was so appreciative that he was so tactful about it that they ended up becoming lifelong friends. And I didn't put down what this guy's name was.
It's a lifelong friend, but you can't remember the damn name.
Well, he only comes up a couple times in this story, which is why I don't remember his name.
Fair.
Heisman, of course, because he's skint broke, and at this point he's kind of starting to miss football again. He decides to go ahead and take a job as the football coach at Alabama Polytechnic, which is today Auburn University. In the 1896 season was his first season. He coached a total of 5 seasons at Auburn, and at 1896 his team went 3-1, and that year he witnessed something that would both change his life and also change the trajectory of college football forever. Which is, while he was right before his season started, he went to another game that was being played by, I think, Georgia and a school in Virginia. I can't remember for sure. I'm pretty sure Georgia was one of them, though. But one of the teams, the team that was playing offense, their quarterback ended up surrounded, and he had possession of the ball, and his O-line was collapsing, and he started to panic. And so, without any way to get out, he just kind of threw the ball in panic, and he threw it in a forward pass, and it was caught by one of his ends. And that end ended up taking the ball all the way down for a touchdown.
Fuck yes.
And the problem was, at the time, forward passing was illegal in football. It was against the rules.
Ah, god damn it.
This wasn't a game that Heisman was coaching. This was another game between two other schools that he had just happened to be going to watch. And he saw this forward pass, and even though it was against the rules, he realized that this would be a really beneficial addition to college football if this were made, because there's so much creative stuff you could do with a forward pass.
Yeah, that's why it kind of revolves around modern football now.
Yeah, nowadays forward passes are like half of the game of college football, but back then John Heisman was the first guy to really sit down and look at it and think there's so much potential here. Why is this not part of the game? And so after that, he started to become a strong vocal, open proponent of the idea of adding the forward pass to football. So yeah, that was his 1896 season. 1897, he got 2 wins, no losses, and a tie. The team wasn't able to finish that season because a really big thing happened that year in the history of college football, and that was the death of the quarterback for the University of Georgia, Richard Von Gammon.
Okay, that means nothing to me.
Yeah, Richard Von Gammon was a quarterback for the University of Georgia, and during a game against, I think, the University of Virginia, he was tackled, and after, or no, he wasn't tackle. This was when he was playing safety on, or no, he was playing on the D line. He was on defense. It was his position on defense. On offense, he was quarterback, but on defense, I think he was on the D line. And he tried to come in for a tackle on the ball carrier during a play, but when he launched himself, he missed, and he ended up driving himself into like a wedge between a few other players. And as he fell to the ground, he kind of dragged these other players down with him, who a bunch of linemen basically fell on top of his head.
Ugh.
So he had three 220 pound linemen just fall right on top of his head, and it more or less kind of crushed his skull.
I mean, this is before helmets too, so like.
Yes, none of them were wearing helmets. At most, some of them were wearing like these primitive like nose guards, which are just like metal frames that they kind of wore around their face that protected their nose.
This is like Leatherhead days, right? Where they have that like leather helmet thing.
This was before leather helmets.
Ah, so they're wearing nothing on their heads.
They are wearing like thin wool coats and knee shorts. That is all they're wearing.
So they don't have shoulder pads. They don't have shit.
They don't have shit. They have like the clothes that you'd see a homeless person wearing in like the 1840s.
Legit.
So after this injury, when they dragged the pile off of him, he was still conscious and he tried to stand up. But as soon as he stood up, he fell back down to his knees and he started vomiting right there on the field.
That's when you know you're fucked up.
Yeah. And then after he vomited, he collapsed. And a physician happened to be in the crowd, and he came down, and he had been there as like, back then they didn't have like official like medical staff on site for treating injuries.
I figure that's relatively recent where we have medical staff on hand, like maybe the 90s, maybe if I'm pushing it, late 80s.
Yeah, but even into like going back to like the 1930s, 1940s, football teams had at least like a guy who was trained in first aid. In the 1890s, they didn't have shit. And so there was actually like this small movement of doctors who would go to football games with all of their medical gear in a bag, specifically in the event that somebody got hurt.
That's when you know this sport was way too fucking dangerous to be played like the way it was back then.
Oh god, it gets so fucking bad later on. We're gonna talk about when the president had to step in to get the game fixed. But yeah, so a physician came down from the crowd and basically took one look at this guy's skull and was like, oh, he's probably not going to make it. And so basically all he did was he administered some morphine to help with the pain, and then they carried him on a stretcher to the local hospital, and he died later that night. And this death, because it happened in front of a crowd of like several thousand people, and it happened to one of the big stars of Southern football.
Oh yeah, it would fuck some people up. At least it should.
Yeah, this caused such a enormous moral panic in the South that several Southern universities immediately, like 2 days after the death, they immediately suspended their football programs, including Auburn. And then within the month, the state of Georgia, the legislature of the state of Georgia had
banned football.
They had introduced legislation to ban football and had passed the state house and the state senate, and it was on the governor's desk when the governor received a letter from the mother of the player who had died, who basically said, please don't use my son's death as a sacrifice to ban the one thing that he loved most of all in this life, which was football.
That feels really fucking convenient.
Maybe, but I can see it go, like, I could see it being kind of contrived, but at the time, like, the public in the South, and especially politicians in the South, didn't like football. It was kind of seen as a very barbaric sort of, well, for one thing, it was considered a barbaric sport. It was way too violent for their Christian sensibilities. For another thing, it was considered a Yankee sport. It was something they imported from a bunch of Northerners. And they they didn't like it on those grounds as well. And so, but once the governor got this letter from that player's mother, he decided to go ahead and veto the bill and came out publicly saying, we don't need to ban this sport. The sport can still be a good, positive thing. We just need to make sure that it's regulated better. And so that governor ended up becoming one of the prominent spokespeople for like the regulation of safety within college sports. So that's why. So in the aftermath of that, that's when John Heisman really started advocating the legalization of the forward pass within the rules of football. Because the forward pass, in his mind, and something that's kind of been proven to be true, is that the forward pass would make the game much more open. Because at the time, football was really based around linemen getting into like this brawl in the middle of the field, trying to open up holes in order to let the ball carrier go through. And that was what caused a lot of injuries. And so Heisman kind of proposed that if we open up the game to the forward pass, it will force the line to extend across the entire field, and it will limit the amount of physical contact that's actually being made between different players, and that will limit the amount of opportunities there are for these types of injuries to happen. And eventually, later on, when the forward pass was legalized, that would turn out to be completely 100% true. That's why there's so much fewer injuries in football than there were back then.
I mean, I don't really feel like we're exactly addressing all the injuries even today, though, because like traumatic brain injuries happen a fucking lot unreported. Like people's brains become soup and we don't even realize it until like, hey, this guy went on a really rampant crime spree. Oh wait, this fucker probably had brain damage. Sky King, like his impulsivity control could probably be led back to the brain injuries he got.
Yeah, you are 100% correct. Modern American football is absolutely unable to address the issue of like the long-term effects of repeated brain injuries within football. But on the other hand, at the worst that it got during this past time period, an average of like 15 people across the country were dying in football games. And an average of like 120, 130 like crippling injuries. Compared to today where we have like one every few years, maybe. So like, yes, it's still a really bad problem with football. On the other hand, back then it had like huge body counts. So like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I get what you're saying in comparison, but I still don't think we figured out the safest. Like, there's a lot more shit we need to do before football is like safe, if it's even possible to be safe without like permanently disfiguring these people. At the very least, if we're gonna have these traumatic brain injuries, sorry to get on a soapbox of like, hey, we should be doing better kind of thing, but at the very least, they should be taken care of way fucking better than they should be get paid out for the rest of their life of like, kind of like disability. Like, hey, you were fucked up by football. You should get a yearly check for how long you were in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I genuinely 100% agree. Like,
and they should have lifelong insurance from the NFL, the college football, wherever they went to. They should have insurance covered.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. It's a game where these guys are literally sacrificing their own physical bodies for entertainment. And I think as much as I love the sport, God, it is really fucking barbaric.
Oh, it is. It 1000% is.
But yeah, so yeah, that's why the 1897 season was cut off, was because this kid's death basically almost caused the banning of football in the South, which is wild to think that it ever got to that point, because football is just so synonymous with the South.
Oh, for certain.
So, because the season got cut off, the Auburn team ended up ending the 1897 season in debt, like $700 in debt, because they didn't have the expected income from ticket sales to be able to recuperate it. And so I haven't mentioned this before, but this whole time that this is all going on, Heisman is still acting.
As head coach and on the team?
No, he's acting in plays.
What do you mean act? Oh shit! He's still a theater nerd. I forgot about that. This motherfucker is basically blind and is still acting in plays and doing football.
Well, okay, by this point, his vision has mostly come back. He can read with like reading glasses by this point.
I thought that was just a permanent thing.
No, his sight eventually mostly came back. It was never fully 100% back, but it did come back enough for him to be able to read. But yeah, this whole time I've been talking, on the side, he's also been involved in like local theater troupes, putting on like plays. Like, he's been doing a lot of Shakespeare, but he's also been doing some like other more contemporary work. And so when Auburn ended the 1897 season in debt, he put on a play in order to recuperate that debt. And he was able to bring in enough money just based on his name recognition, because by this point he was one of like he was basically the most beloved football coach in the South by this point.
Damn.
Yeah, people in the South loved him. Which is crazy because he's a Yankee. He's a Northerner. And he came to the South.
Those goddamn Yanks.
Yeah, the pioneer, the guy who invented the Southern obsession with football was from fucking Pennsylvania, which is crazy.
Just shows you that Americans will co-opt anything, even themselves.
So yeah, he put on a theater play of like, I can't remember what it was called. It was some comedy that was a big deal at the time. And just off of name recognition alone, he was able to recuperate and pay off the debt with ticket sales to his play. So by the time that he left Auburn after the 1899 season, he was one of the most famous coaches in the country, and he was described by one sports writer as, quote, the undisputed master of Southern football.
Damn.
And that's part of what he's remembered for today, is he is the guy who kind of founded the Southern U.S.'s obsession with football. He is the reason why so many Southern teams are like long-term generational powerhouse programs. Some of them because they were inspired by like the culture that he built around Southern football, and part of it because he'd had a direct hand in coaching the teams that would eventually build the programs that became modern powerhouses, like Auburn and later on Clemson and Georgia Tech. Like, the guy's influence on specifically Southern football was unmeasurable, and by extension all of American football, not just for like all of his play innovations and all of his rule changes that he helped bring about, but just the type of culture that he built around football just by his sheer presence and his success is incalculable. It's part of why I love this guy so much, because he's a guy who had such an influential effect on like broader American culture by way of football, while being like a genuinely good guy. I love Heisman so much because he's the first guy on this show, on this podcast that we do, that I've talked about that I have nothing objectionable to say about him.
Damn.
He was just a genuinely good person, and he had an enormous effect on the development of like modern American culture by way of sports. And so yeah, this is where that begins. This is when he goes from like a pretty good like local football coach to like John Heisman, the legend John Heisman.
Damn.
And it's only going to go further and further and further from here. So after 1899, he moves from Auburn to Clemson University, and the reason he's hired at Clemson is because the athletics director who had hired him to Auburn had since then by that point moved over to Clemson, and offered Heisman to kind of come along with him, and he was he said yes, partially because at Auburn he was I believe the fourth highest paid football coach in the country. He made $2,200 a year, and at Clemson he became the number one highest paid football coach in the country.
Wow.
He made $2,250.
That's insane for back then.
Yeah, but on top of that, his contract also guaranteed him 30% of the profit of all ticket sales, which made him fucking loaded.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's kind of the first guy to get rich off of coaching football. So in his first year at Clemson, because at this time Clemson is like a consistent contender for like the national championship. The NCAA championship. Back then, they were nobodies. They were a backwater nowhere school with a football team that nobody had heard of. In one season, he made them one of the most famous teams in the country.
Wow.
And they have been in that position ever since. There's never been a moment in Clemson's history where they haven't been like pretty good. And it started here with John Heisman. So he won his first conference championship. At the time, the conference they played in was the SIAA, the Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Association. That's what it was called. That was their conference the Southern teams played in. And Clemson, his first year at Clemson, they went from a losing record the year before to the SIAA conference championships in 1900.
Christ almighty.
He would win 2 more in 1902 and 1903.
Holy shiznit.
In 1901, his Clemson team scored the highest scoring game that Clemson has had in their entire history up to today when they beat Guilford College 122-0.
What?
Okay, from this point forward, this is where we get into the fucking crazy numbers. This is where we're good. We're shifting into third gear. We're shifting into the fourth gear. We're going fucking full speed ahead. This is Heisman.
Heisman shifted into maximum fucking overdrive.
This is maximum overdrive for John Heisman's career, and it keeps going up and up and up. It's getting so fucking crazy now. Okay, so one game while he was at Clemson, he played Georgia Tech, and in order to put Georgia Tech off their guard, he tricked Tech's team into believing that the Clemson team had been up all night partying because he had sent some of his substitute players who weren't going to be playing the next day to a hotel in Atlanta in order to stay up all night and party. And they invited a bunch of Georgia Tech players. And so the Georgia Tech players, they said no, but they knew that the Clemson, or they thought they knew that the Clemson players had been up all night partying. And so when they went into the game the next day, they were cocky and they were overconfident and they were kind of lazy because they thought they were going to be playing a bunch of guys that hadn't slept all night and were still half drunk. Clemson beat Georgia Tech that day 44-5.
Christ almighty. That's just like teabagging them when they're down.
Yeah. There was another game that he coached against Furman University. It was an away game at Furman University's field. And at Furman University, they didn't have like a real legitimate stadium yet, this was back when stadiums were like a really rare thing for college football. Their stadiums. So this season is when he kind of becomes famous for his trick plays. And not just trick plays, but like trick strategies, like on and off the field to kind of fuck with people, to kind of fuck with the other team. Because this is one thing that I'll say about Heisman. He was a consummate sportsman to his very core. He was passionate about the concept of like sportsmanship within football.
Oh no, like for real, like I think I don't believe in cheating. I feel like if you find loopholes around it, as long as you're not breaking you can break the spirit just a tiny bit, but if you're like full out and out breaking the spirit of the rules, I feel like that's still cheating.
The thing was, like, even though he was such a strong like adherent to the ideals of like sportsmanship, the idea of what was sportsmanlike in the sport at the time was a lot looser than it is now. So like he did a lot of like stuff that today would be considered really scummy. Back then was taken with really good humor. So stuff like what he did with Georgia Tech, tricking them into thinking that his team had been up partying all night. And then this one, at a game against Furman University, they were playing at Furman. And Furman was kind of a poorer school. They didn't have like their own dedicated field or bleachers or anything. And so the field that they had to paint their hash lines on had a tree it had an oak tree growing on the field.
What?
Yeah, that was something that just kind of happened in football back then. Sometimes you'd have to play on a field that wasn't like completely even in some cases, and so there was just a tree on this field. I think it was kind of
I could understand fields not being perfectly flat, but a tree in the field?
yeah, yeah, and it wasn't like in the middle of the field. It's kind of off to the side. It was like right on the sideline, but it was there, and it did sometimes get in the way. But Heisman played this to his advantage. He had his team captain call plays that allowed them to do lateral passes towards the tree whenever they were next to it, and the tree would get in the way of any defenders trying to do interference on the ball carrier. So whenever one of the ends would get the ball from a lateral pass, they'd have the tree in the way that would keep the other team's Furman players from kind of getting to them, and that was one of the ways that was just kind of like the creative stuff that Heisman could do, like on the fly, to just kind of give his team any advantage they could, and it worked every time. There was after the 1903 season, there was a postseason game that was organized between Clemson and Cumberland College in Tennessee, and this game was basically just to decide who the conference champion would be, because both teams were undefeated that season, and so they just had decided to have like one more postseason game to decide who the conference champion would be. The problem was at the end of the game they tied 11-11, and so officially the league declared both of them to be co-champions for that season, which is why Clemson is listed as a champion for a conference champion for that season. But technically both of them hold it. But after the game, Heisman came out to a couple sports writers and he was basically like, yeah, I think Cumberland deserves to have that title by themselves, because even though we tied, they played the better game.
That's very sportsman of him.
Yeah, that was very like genuine and honest, and he wasn't doing it to like shit talk his own team. Like, he was very open about, like, yeah, my players are fucking fantastic. They're doing great. They played a great game. Cumberland just happened to be really good, and I think they played better in that particular game, so I think they deserve the title. And this was taken very well at Cumberland. Like, a lot of people at Cumberland like very deeply respected him. Not all of them, though. This is what we call foreshadowing. So, also that same year, 1903. He met during one of his the plays that he was helping produce and acting in. He met another actor by the name of Evelyn Cox, and the two of them, they fell in love and they married, and they got married later that year. And so that year he did end up getting married. They never had children together, but she did have a child from a previous marriage, Carlisle Cox. And he formally, like, officially adopted Carlisle as his own son.
Hella respectable.
Yeah, so that was he never had any biological children, but Carlisle was his son. He always treated Carlisle like his son, and was a genuine father to him, which is really cool, because later on they'll end up getting divorced, but he will still be a dad, like, still be a father in Carlisle's life after that.
That's the kind of man I respect, is like, hey, I adopted this kid. I adopted him. It doesn't matter if, like, that's the one thing that really impressed me when Gabriel Iglesias Fluffy got divorced. His son that he adopted was still his son afterwards, and he still treats him as such.
Yeah, that's really respectable.
I really don't like the. It's like those people who have raised a kid their whole life and then immediately bow out of their life after, like, hey, either they were a step parent or like, hey, I found out my wife cheated. Like, I get you're going to have resentment towards that child because you found out they're not yours after raising them like your own. But that doesn't destroy the bond you had with the child. That destroys the bond you had with the mother.
I don't know if I'm just like an asshole about this, but I would take it a step further. If you have any resentment towards the child in that situation, you're just an asshole.
I can understand maybe not having resentment towards the child, but not being able to be around the child without feeling resentment because of the mother. Maybe it's not literally directed at the child per se, but being around them brings up the resentment.
I can understand having the emotions there, but like actually acting on the emotions and like treating the kid worse because you don't like their mother is like that like have some fucking self-control. Like that's literally just like an impulse issue. That's like that's like you never grew up past like toddler stage. Like that should be an emotion that you should be able to get past because you see an actual child who is their own person beyond those feelings. So anyways, so yeah, he is married now. A lovely lady named Evelyn Cox and now has adopted a son named Carlisle. After 1903, he got offered a better pay by another program. So in 1903, Heisman's Clemson team beat Georgia Tech 73-0.
Damn.
And so after the season, Georgia Tech came to Heisman and was like, "Hey, if you want to come coach here, we've got a better deal for you. We can give you more money." And so he was like, yeah, that's fair. The only catch was this time he had to be both the football and the baseball, or actually football, baseball, and basketball coach.
Oh, hell.
Yeah, so he was coaching all three, which is difficult, but he was getting fucking rich off of it. So like he didn't care, and he loved all three sports, so he was perfectly fine with it.
That's 3 sips, by the way.
Ah, yes. He's ended his career at Clemson, and now he is moving on to Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech is the big famous one that he's really known for. This is the famous coaching career that he's most famous for. And he would end up staying at Georgia Tech for 16 years, which is a lot long. Back then, that was crazy long, but even today, that's a lot longer than most coaches stay at a program.
Yeah.
So he would coach at Georgia Tech for 16 years, and in that time, he would never have a losing season.
God damn.
He would have 3 undefeated seasons, and those three undefeated seasons would be in a row, which gave him a winning streak of 32 games.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, he was so good at his job. In the 1905 season was really like a low point for college football in general. And it was when the federal government had to step in and kind of take control of things in college football. Because in 1905, after the 1905 season, 18 players were killed across the country.
Damn.
And 159 were permanently crippled.
What the fuck?
Yeah. It was a brutal season of football. And it was so bad that there was another like big moral panic over football, and there were calls for it to be banned.
Understandably so.
Understandably, but luckily for the sport, the guy who was president at the time was Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt loved football. He was a football player at Harvard, and he was a pretty damn good player at the time too. And he adored football. He loved football until the day he died. It one of his great passions, amongst other various manly pursuits.
He was one of the manly man presidents.
Yeah, he is the archetype for like a manly, like a masculine American specimen.
Was it Theodore who got shot?
Yeah, he got shot
and still continued his fucking speech.
Yeah, he just plugged a nap.
Actually shot, not like Trump, and just got grazed.
Yeah, he plugged a napkin into the bullet hole and then gave an hour-long speech before he went to the doctor.
I always heard he just fucking ignored it.
No, it didn't. It's not that he ignored it, because when he got shot, he got like knocked over in pain, and they were trying to treat him on the scene.
I always kind of heard it as he was standing up, got shot. Just the shooter was kind of escorted off, and he just continued, and he didn't even acknowledge the shooting.
No, that was kind of an exaggeration.
No, I've been shot or something like that, but like physically didn't acknowledge it.
He definitely did physically acknowledge it. Like when he was shot, he like fell over and was like screaming in pain. And so like he was attended to, and like they started to treat him, but like once he kind of came to his senses and kind of got the pain, like mentally got the pain under control, he kind of just like took a neckerchief and plugged it into the hole, and then he got up and he continued giving a speech. And then it was after he was done giving his speech that he actually agreed to go to the hospital. And then on the way to the hospital, he stopped for food. I can't remember if that part's true. I heard it somewhere. I don't know if it's true, but so yeah, Teddy Roosevelt was the president at the time, and he was a former football player and a big fan of the sport, and he didn't want to see it die, but he also agreed
changes need to happen.
This isn't good. Also, fun fact in regards to Teddy and football. Did you know that when he formed his Rough Riders to go off and fight in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, a big portion, like about half of all of the guys that were in the Rough Riders were former Harvard football players?
No, I did not.
Yeah. And then the rest of them were like cowboys and like guys who worked on ranches in the West.
That doesn't surprise me.
So yeah, Teddy Roosevelt, he basically came out and he gave two like public press conferences where he announced basically, one, the game of football is too dangerous to go on continuing the way that it is, and two, that's why we're going to form an organization in order to regulate the sport, in order to make it safer and healthier for its intended purpose of creating like healthy, well-rounded young men. And that is how Teddy Roosevelt founded the National Collegiate Athletic Association, the NCAA, which immediately took over the position of legislating and organizing the official rules for college athletics, but also it's still the body that governs and organizes college sports to this day. Today, yeah.
That recently got sued, so they have to pay their athletes.
Yeah, that was an interesting development.
And be able to use their, monetize their likeness.
Yeah, good.
Which should have happened decades ago.
Yeah, good for them. The next step is college football players need to unionize.
Fuck yes.
And that is not me joking. That is a genuine... College football players need to unionize.
They shouldn't just be getting scholarships and, like, the good old boy, like, oh, you can have this, that, and the other thing. They should be actually paid because, like, colleges are making bank off of these athletes.
Yeah. Either you return college football to being an amateur sport or you fucking pay them like they deserve.
It's not an amateur sport anymore. It's not. I'm sorry, but it's not.
Yeah, it's not an amateur sport. That's why they need to be paid. So either stop like corporatizing the sport in order to make it a for-profit venture for these fucking ghouls who run all of these universities.
Well, it's like, it's the same argument I've heard and no one likes to hear. Oh, we should pay people more. Or how about we just say, hey, we've increased the pay cap and no, you're not allowed to raise the prices to keep your profits the same level so you can have executives paid out billions of dollars. How about we just make it so, like, hey, at the end of the year, you can't pay out more than blah, blah, blah after pay increases. There are plenty of ways to regulate it to, like, say, hey, don't be greedy fucks and get millions to billions of dollars paid out to individuals.
Oh yeah, don't get me wrong. I love being a Fight Texas Aggie myself. I'm a big fan of the fact that my school holds the distinction of having the 4th largest stadium on the face of the planet. That doesn't do anything for like the actual purpose of the sport. That doesn't do anything for sportsmanship or physical fitness or school pride. It doesn't do horseshit.
Some of these stadiums are absolutely fucking insane.
It is.
And they don't need to be that big.
It is purely for making money off of ticket sales and making money from alumni. That is what the purpose of these giant fucking stadiums and what all of the commercialization of college football is. It is to make fucking money for school executives. And I hate it. I hate it. I want football to be a sport I can be proud of. I want football to be a sport that, like, I care about, not because it's a big spectacle, but...
Not in our lifetimes.
Not because it's a big spectacle, but because I feel like I'm part of the team.
Again, it's not going to happen in our lifetimes.
Well, unless the entire system of financial capital collapses and gets replaced with something more equitable. Oh, no. After all of those players were killed in the 1905 season... Teddy Roosevelt stepped in, he helped found the NCAA, and now the NCAA regulates rules. And one of the big rules that the NCAA introduced was adopted specifically because John Heisman advocated for it. and that was legalizing the forward pass. So that is when 1905 is when the forward pass became legal in college football, and it was directly because of John Heisman's lobbying, which is one of the most influential developments in the history of the sport, and is one of the most important facets of the game to this day. And so, but on top of that, because this is, I will admit, this was good for the sport because it was adopted on safety grounds. Because, like I said, a game that includes the forward pass is a much more spread out game and doesn't require as much physical contact and therefore is much safer, which is true. But it also helped Heisman because he had been developing an entire playbook centered around the forward pass for years before it was legalized. And so when it finally was, he got to unleash that rule book and made Georgia Tech one of the top schools in the fucking country.
Damn.
They would be dominant, winning several conference championships every, most years that he was there, he won conference championships. And then finally in 1916, Georgia Tech won the national championship. And Heisman got his first and his first and only national championship title was in 1916 with Georgia Tech. 1916 was an exciting fucking year because you know how I was telling you about the most brutal game in the history of college football?
You brought it up, yes?
Yeah. I'm going to tell you about the most brutal game in the history of college football.
I assumed that's what I was getting at earlier. I assumed that was during that year where they legislated it.
No, that was 1905. This game is going to be played in 1916, the year that Georgia Tech won the national title. So do you remember earlier when I mentioned that team that they tied with, it was Cumberland College. They tied with Georgia Tech, or not with Georgia Tech, with Clemson for the conference title way back when. And even though they tied, Heisman came out and said that, that Cumberland played better. So they honestly deserve the title more than we do. You remember that?
Yes. Yes, I remember that.
So Cumberland College is a school in Lebanon, Tennessee. And in 1916, they disbanded their football team. And it wasn't because Cumberland wasn't good. They were a pretty solid team, consistently playing against high-powered teams like Alabama, Auburn, Clemson. But they just didn't have the money to sustain a football program. And they couldn't keep a coach around to save their lives. And so they just decided to get rid of their football program and focus on other sports like baseball and basketball. That year, Cumberland played Georgia Tech in the 1916 baseball season. And during a game between Cumberland and Georgia Tech, Cumberland beat the snot out of Georgia Tech's team, which was coached by John Heisman, and they beat them 22-0. This was very disheartening to Heisman, naturally, but initially he accepted it. It was, it's part of the game is losing sometimes, even losing pretty bad. You take it on the chin, you get better, you go back. The problem was Heisman found out that Cumberland had used ringers during this game.
What is a ringer?
A ringer is a professional athlete that a college football team would bring in, disguised as actual, student players.
Well, that's just against the spirit of the game.
Yeah, it's absolutely against the spirit of the game. And it was extremely unsportsmanlike. And John Heisman, by this point in his career, was a college football god. And he was the college football god of sportsmanship. Normally, he was a very benevolent god. But when he found out what Cumberland had done, he became an Old Testament god.
Fire and brimstone?
Fire and brimstone. He would destroy the great cities. He would tear open the firmament and rain down fire upon the non-believers.
Shun the non-believer, shine.
So, after he found out about these ringers that Cumberland had used in their baseball game...
Magical Leopluridon.
Shut the fuck up. So, after he found out that Cumberland had used ringers in his 22-0 defeat, he basically went to Cumberland and basically said, hey, we have a contract here that says that we are going to play a game this coming fall between our football teams. And Cumberland said, but wait, we don't have a football team anymore, so we can't do that. And Heisman said, okay, that's fine. But if you do, then I'm going to go through the NCAA and you're going to get fined $3,000 for breach of contract.
Fuck yeah.
The reason that Cumberland got rid of their football program in the first place was because they couldn't afford it. They couldn't afford a $3,000 fine. It would bankrupt the school. And so they were forced to put together a makeshift team in order to play this one game in the 1916 season against Georgia Tech, coached by John fucking Heisman in his prime.
That's evil. That's absolutely evil.
At the height of his career. So Cumberland ended up putting together a makeshift team out of a bunch of law students who had never played football before. And it was being coached by a guy who had played on the Cumberland team the year before, but had only played football for a year and had no experience in training or coaching. Let's talk about Cumberland's football team. By the way, I should mention off the top, because I think it's funny, this is the last football game that Cumberland College will ever play.
It sounds like Heisman just fucking destroyed them.
Yeah, to this day, Cumberland College still does not have a football team.
Rightfully so.
Cumberland. So in the opening play of the game, Cumberland wins the coin toss and elect to receive the kick. They receive, and they caught it. And as soon as the ball was in the catcher's hand, he was tackled and brought to the ground and had a broken rib and had to be carried off. In that opening run, they got stopped behind the line of scrimmage 3 times in a row, landing them at 4th and 22, which resulted in them having to punt. Georgia Tech receives the punt and immediately runs down the field and scores. This is 30 seconds into the game.
Holy shit, he ran circles around these motherfuckers.
Cumberland receives the ball back from a kick, fumbles trying to catch the kick. Georgia Tech recovers it and then scores again. And it just goes on like that. It just goes on and on and on and on and on for the entire game.
By how many points?
Hold on, I'll get to that. At halftime, the coach of Cumberland requests that they end the game at the half in order to let Cumberland go with a loss. Heisman agrees, but he doesn't agree to ending it immediately. He agrees to taking 6 minutes off the end of the clock.
That's a smack in the face.
So instead of halftime, or instead of the second half being 30 minutes, it's only 24 minutes. Because Coach John William Heisman is a cruel god.
I mean, they shouldn't have fucked with God.
They shouldn't have fucked with God, no. Over the course of the game, Cumberland's quarterback had to be carried off the field unconscious with a concussion 3 times. And it was the same guy.
Jesus Christ.
He had 3 life-altering concussions in the same game, and he just kept trying to go back out. By the 3rd quarter, when he tried to go out again, he was so out of it that he couldn't tell which way the line of scrimmage was. He would try to line up, and he would be like angled 45 degrees to the left because he couldn't physically see the play. He couldn't physically see the line. He couldn't see where the players were lining up. He couldn't understand what was going on around him. His 3rd concussion happened when the Cumberland center spiked the ball, and instead of catching it, it smacked him in the head, and he fell backwards and smashed his head into the ground. That's how he got his 3rd concussion.
Jesus Christ.
He had trouble, after he recovered from his concussion, he had trouble walking for the rest of his life. At one point, a Cumberland player received a kick and actually managed to catch it, they dropped most of those catches. When he caught it, he became so scared at all of the Georgia Tech players that were like bearing down on him that he dropped the ball and he ran off of the field in fear.
I love that.
He ran right past his own field goal, jumped over the fence at the stadium, and then when he got down on the other side of the fence, he tried to curl up and hide so that they wouldn't try to put him back in the game. But then when he got on the other side of the fence, he discovered two of his teammates also hiding. And when they saw him land next to them, they panicked because they were afraid he'd give away their hiding spot. And so they kicked him back out and forced him back over the fence onto the field. And he was forced to play the rest of the game. He came out covered with bruises and with a sprained wrist.
It hurts to laugh, but it's too good.
Later on in the game, a Cumberland player got chased off the field by a stray dog, and he didn't come back. They never saw him again.
I'm glad coaches are, not coaches, but like refs are allowed to say, hey, let's just fucking call it now.
Yeah.
I don't know how often that happens in college games, but I know high school games, they have the power to say, hey, we're calling it.
I don't know about college. I'm sure it's happened in college games. I know it's happened in pro games. There was one game, I think, in the early 2000s where the refs decided to call the game because it became, I think it was a Green Bay game, where it became so physically dangerous to be on the field because everybody in the stands were throwing beer bottles onto the field. And it became so dangerous to actually be physically on the field that they called the game. Okay, so I'm not done with all of the crazy shit that happened in this game.
I didn't figure. You said it was one of the bloodiest, so...
So at one point, one of the Cumberland players got his glasses knocked off. And so while he was on the ground looking for his glasses, the ball was snapped, and the Cumberland quarterback had possession, and he tried to back up to figure out where he was going to go with this play. And as he was backing up, he ran over the guy who was looking for his glasses, and he tripped and fell backwards. And he fumbled the ball, and Georgia Tech recovered, ran it in for a touchdown.
Jesus Christ. After a certain point, that wouldn't even be fun.
Cumberland's only effective defensive play where they actually prevented Georgia Tech from scoring points was when they attempted a maneuver called the climb the ladder play, which is a now illegal play in football for obvious reasons, where three defensive players will form a step, like a stair step, like pyramid, and then a fourth player will climb up them like stairs, and then jump off of...
Jesus Christ.
Jump off of the third one's back in order to gain extra height to try to block a kick, either like a field goal or an extra point.
Christ almighty.
So they did this, they carried this out successfully, but they did it too successfully, and the Cumberland player ended up jumping too high. So when he came up to block the ball, instead of blocking it with his hands, he blocked it with his face.
Oh!
The ball broke his nose so badly that he was permanently disfigured for the rest of his life.
You get the wrong kind of nose injury and it can kill you.
Yeah, the cartilage in his nose ceased to exist the moment the ball hit his face. By the end of the game, Cumberland had a total of negative 28 forward yards for the entire game. They made no first downs. They had 15 turnovers.
Good God.
The top Cumberland passer was Leon McDonald, a law student, with 2 completed passes out of 18 attempts and 6 interceptions.
Holy Christ.
The top Cumberland rusher was Boris Gauger, who had 4 carries for a total of negative 2 rushing yards. A sports writer, Grantland Rice, wrote after the game, Cumberland's greatest individual play of the game occurred when fullback Allen circled right end for a 6-yard loss.
The best play was a 6-yard loss.
Yeah, that was genuinely their best offensive play of the whole game. As a general... So, and then in the Atlanta Journal writing about the game, they said, as a general rule, the only thing necessary for a touchdown was to give a Tech back the ball and holler, here he comes, and there he goes. Georgia Tech scored on every one of its sets of downs.
Has that ever happened before?
I don't think so. I think this is one of the few. There might be like a handful of games where that's happened, but this is the only one I've heard of. There's a legend that that's popular, especially at Georgia Tech, that at this game, Georgia Tech scored on every possession that they had the ball. It's not true, but it's understandable why they believe it, because they did score every time they had a set of downs.
Yeah.
Every single time. And they had it, I think, 32 times.
Good God.
Yeah, they had it 32 times because they scored 32 touchdowns. They had 922 total rushing yards. And here's the crazy shit. This Georgia Tech team was built. Their program was made on Heisman's expertise in the forward pass. This is what made their team national contenders. They didn't pass a single time in this game.
Fucking crap. Could you imagine?
So Cumberland's baseball team earlier that year had beat Georgia Tech's baseball team 22-0. The final score of this game was 222-0.
How many was it? 122?
222-0.
Fuck!
Georgia Tech was up 63-0 at the end of the first quarter.
Good God!
They were 126-0 at the end of the half.
Jesus Christ!
222-0 final score at the last game that Cumberland College would ever play in the sport of football is to this day the highest scoring game of college football ever played.
I certainly hope so.
Simultaneously, it is the highest scoring blowout of any college football game in American history.
Again, I certainly to God hope so.
John Heisman is a legend. I love this. I am so glad I got to tell you the story. When I set out to learn about John Heisman, it started out as I wanted to understand what happened with this game because I wanted to tell you about it so bad. The absolute nightmare, the beautiful work of horrific, gory art that this game was. I just happened to learn along the way about what a cool guy John Heisman was. So I ended up telling you about his whole life. Originally, this was just to tell you this story because it's so...
Of course it was.
Oh my God.
Man's a fucking legend. What else can I say?
So the following... So they win this game and they win the national title in 1916. In 1917, the team went 9-0 and they won the national again. I think. Wait, hold on. Oh, I'm sorry. No, they won Georgia Tech won the conference championship in 1916. They won the national title in 1917 after going 9-0. During the 1917 season, they put up. This was their points. Like this was the number of points. They scored a total of 491 points that season.
Holy crap!
It only had 17 points scored on them out of 9 games. And then, you notice the year 1917? Do you know what happened that year?
World War I?
Yes, that is the year that the United States entered World War I. And it fucked up college football really, really bad.
As assumedly it would.
Yeah, because suddenly all of like these really high-powered, effective team, like the powerhouses of their day, suddenly lost like huge chunks of their best players who went off to enlist and weren't around to play anymore. And so their teams went from having like some of the best drilled, effective players in the country to suddenly being filled with like know-nothing freshmen. And this was the same for Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech did not come out of World War I unscathed. And so the 1918, he didn't have a losing record in 1918, but he had a lot more losses than he would have if the United States hadn't gone into that fucking useless war. And so after the 1918 season, he left in part because it kind of bummed him out to be coaching a losing team, or not even a losing team, just a team that wasn't winning every game.
He got bummed he wasn't shutting everyone out?
Right, yeah. Yeah, I don't think the 1918 season, I don't think they had any shutouts. I think they got scored on in every game, which was really weird for Heisman. That didn't happen to him very often. The same year, we don't really know what happened or what was going on in their relationship, but in multi-dimensional dumpster Phoenix, I love him. So, Also in 1918, his wife divorced him. We don't know. We don't know what was going on, but we know it was slightly bitter. And he was so embarrassed by the divorce that he didn't want to live in the same city as her anymore. And she wanted to stay in Atlanta.
So he moved.
So he ended up moving. So he left Georgia Tech in 1918. He took a year off, and then eventually he took an offer to go coach at his alma mater, Penn. And so he went to Penn. He coached from 1920 to 1922. It was kind of a lackluster coaching tenure. He had some kind of mid seasons, and the only real notable thing that happened while he was there was he lost to Alabama in 1922, which he lost in 1922 to Alabama, which that was the very first time that Bama ever won a game against a team that wasn't from the South.
Damn.
So yeah, and Alabama today is arguably the best football team. So after that, he went over to coach at a school called Washington and Jefferson College, which is in Washington, Pennsylvania. This story is going to be a little confusing, so bear with me, because the school that Heisman is coaching at is called Washington and Jefferson, and the other school in this story is called Washington and Lee. So just bear with me for a second. So he coached for the 1923 season at Washington and Jefferson. It was an okay season. He ended up the highlight was when he beat undefeated West Virginia. So that was pretty solid for a school like with their program. The big thing that I think the biggest thing that happened there was that season they were going to be playing Washington and Lee, which is a school in Virginia. Virginia was segregated, and Washington and Jefferson had one of their star players was black. One of their half end, who was the linchpin of their entire playbook, because he was just so good. He was so fucking good. He's one of those players that like once in a generation. Just like if he had been born like a couple decades later, he would have won the Heisman. He was just such a fucking good player.
There wouldn't have been anyone to inspire the Heisman.
Yeah. When they were playing Washington and Lee, it was a home game, so they were in Pennsylvania, which was not segregated. But when Washington and Lee came to Pennsylvania, they sent a letter, or they wrote like a note to Heisman, basically saying, and this player, his name was Charles West. They basically sent him a note saying, "Bench West or we leave. We refuse." They were basically saying, "We refuse to play a game against a black player."
That's a dick move.
Heisman not only refused, but publicly shamed Washington and Lee.
As he should.
His refusal to bench Charles West was so public that it became like a national story. It became like a public embarrassment for Washington and Lee. And I don't think they played Washington and Jefferson again for like a couple decades after that because of how miserably this went. He publicly refused to bench Charles West, and not only did Heisman back Charles, but this is what he told the press. Or not, Heisman didn't tell the press, but like I think the athletic director at Washington and Jefferson, who was backing up Heisman, he told the press, I'm sorry the unfortunate condition arose. I respect the tradition which Washington and Lee followed in refusing to play the game, but Washington and Jefferson College is a northern school with traditions too. It has never made any distinction against color or creed in controlling its students. Charles West, who was the cause of the controversy, has been one of the best students in the college for the last 3 years. He has been an honor to the school, both as a student and as an athlete, adding to its prestige by his gentlemanly conduct and his efforts as an athlete. This is why I said I was so worried going into this story that I was going to read Heisman's biography, and I was going to find out about some like horrific racist shit that he did at some point in his life. And then I got to this point, I was like, oh my fucking God, he's a genuinely good guy.
This man stood on business.
This man put his entire career as it was on the line at this time to defend one of his players from racism.
He stood on business.
What a fucking incredible guy.
Legend.
God, I love this guy so much. Okay, we're almost to the end of the story. I've got a couple more stories to tell you about some crazy shit that happened in his life. While he was coaching at Washington and Jefferson, one day he is on the field at practice, running drills with his team, giving directions. And while he's running a drill, he hears a familiar shout from the crowd, or from the crowd that's up in the stands, because people like to come and just watch the players practice. He heard a familiar shout from the crowd calling out his name and cheering him on, telling him how great he was doing and how great his team looked. And he looked up and he looked in the stands and he saw the face of Edith Cole.
Did she survive?
She survived her tuberculosis.
Holy shit!
So what had happened was after she had survived, after the worst of the TB had passed, she had tried to get back in contact with Heisman, but she was never she didn't feel comfortable doing it because she was intimidated because he became so famous and prominent.
Yeah.
And so she felt kind of like intimidated by the idea of like trying to, because at this point he's famous.
He's John fucking Heisman at this point.
He's John fucking Heisman. Why would he take me back after how we left? And then she kept kicking it around in her head. She thought, well, maybe I can, maybe I can't. And then eventually he got married. And she decided, okay, well, that opportunity's gone. I'll move on with my life. Years later, the rest of her family has died. She's never been married. And like her parents are dead. She doesn't talk to most of her siblings. And she eventually and then she finds out, she hears in the news that
he's divorced.
Heisman is divorced and he's leaving Georgia Tech and he's coming back north. He's coming back north to Pennsylvania. And so she decides to take this opportunity, and she gets back and she comes back and she goes to she starts going to his practices and to his games and like watching, and she sees the same man that she fell in love with all those years ago, who coached at Bechtel and at Oberlin. He's the same man who's now coaching at Washington and Jefferson.
He's fundamentally the same man, if not a better version of himself.
If not a better man, yeah. And so she finally decides to do her old thing that she always did when she watched him coach back at Oberlin. Was she cheered him on. She encouraged him, and that's how they reconnected and they reunited. Within the year they were married.
Fuck yes.
Fuck yes. God, it's such a fucking good story. So John Heisman's last coaching job was at Rice University. He coached there from 1924 to 1927. None of those 4 seasons that he coached, he had a winning record. Yeah, he's kind of getting up there in age.
And you said his eyesight never fully recovered. Like, yeah, he was able to see again, but like
he saw fine. He only really just needed reading glasses. Other than that, he could see fine. But yeah, I can't imagine him. So yeah, he coaches at Rice University for 4 years. Rice is in Houston, by the way.
Okay.
And nothing eventful happens. He didn't have a winning season in the 4 years he was there. And then he gets to 1927, the end of the 1927 season, and he retires from football.
Respectable.
So yeah, 1927, 58 years old, he finally retires from football. He ends up being offered like an easy sort of simple job as the athletic director at it's basically like a private sports club for rich people in New York City. It's called the Downtown Athletic Club in Manhattan.
Interesting.
And he basically gets hired on as like the athletic director, which basically just means he organizes like sports games for a bunch of rich people. And it's a really fucking easy gig. He gets nice money off of it, and he can basically retire off of it. While he was there, the club started doing this, giving out this award where they would take a bunch of like prominent sports journalists and they'd ask them to come in and vote on who they thought was the best college football player in the country for that year.
Is this the origin of the Heisman?
Yes. Yeah, it's originally created as the Downtown Athletic Club Award. And initially when it's proposed, Heisman fucking hates it. He hates the idea because Heisman had this ideology of like a sport isn't played
for recognition. It's played as a team.
Yeah, it's played as a team. You don't award individuals, you award the team.
I really genuinely agree with that because it always feels gaudy and it feels like we're making celebrities out of individuals when if you look at like at least certain like athletes, if they didn't have the team they had, even though there's the people on their team were like didn't get famous or didn't get real as famous as the one big name, they wouldn't have made it as big as they did.
Yeah. On the other hand, every time I think back to the way that people seethed and malded over Johnny Manziel winning the Heisman in 2012, and remembering the satisfaction I felt at how fucking mad people were about that, I get so much satisfaction out of that.
I have no context for that.
One of those feelings that just keeps me, just kind of invigorates me whenever I'm feeling down. Just how fucking angry people were when Manziel won the Heisman.
Fair enough.
Oh God, my heart. So yeah, he hates the idea for this award. He doesn't think it's a good idea. He despises the idea, but eventually, he's an old guy. He's just kind of plodding along. He goes along with it because he's like, well, there are some players that are legitimately just like really good. That maybe it's fine to give them some recognition every once in a while. John William Heisman died of pneumonia on October 3rd, 1936, at the age of 76.
That's a very respectable age.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
It's common to die at that age of pneumonia today, so like, fuck yeah.
He was buried in a graveyard in his wife's hometown of Rhinelander, Wisconsin, which is kind of random.
Yeah.
I don't know if he ever actually spent any time in Wisconsin when he was alive, to my knowledge. So I would have sent him.
It could be wanting to be I'm thinking of it from this. He wants to be buried with his wife, and his wife he didn't care where he was buried, but his wife wanted to be buried there in the future, obviously. Like I'm assuming she survived him.
Yeah, I can see that. If I were in his shoes, I would have been buried in Atlanta.
I don't give a shit where my bones rest. Hell, just burn me.
I would have gone back to Atlanta. Shortly after his death, the Downtown Athletic Club Award changed. The name was changed by the athletic club to the Heisman Memorial Trophy. And today, that trophy is the most prestigious award given to an individual player in all of college football, in memory of
the greatest player and coach of all time.
Possibly, in my opinion, not the greatest player. There have been some players that were much better than him, but coaching, goddamn right, I think.
I mean, I'm pretty sure, like from what you've told me, it sounds like he shaped our modern version of football.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Definitely Southern football. He was the mastermind behind Southern football. And you could easily make an argument that he was the most influential thinker in the development of American football in general. And another big thing about him is, alongside all of the different plays that he pioneered, the way of understanding, because his developments in football they weren't just contributions to football itself. He was also as part of his job as to try and make football a science. That was his big thing, was he made football a scientific thing. He picked science apart he picked football apart at the molecular level to understand how it works and functions in every aspect. And that sort of scientific approach to football is probably his biggest, most prominent influence on the game today. Because that is just how football is understood today. If you're a coach or an administrator or an athletic director or a trainer, you understand football in this way specifically because Heisman made that the standard. And it has made the game it's made the game like a vessel for pushing the limits of the human body. He's created what I think is a relatively safe and functional way of pushing the outer limits of what a human being is capable of physically. And every year, it just keeps getting pushed further and further. We haven't hit the limit yet, which is incredible to me. If you were to drop a college football player from today and put them on a college football team for Heisman's time, they would single-handedly sweep every single game because of how much further people and athletes in the sport has come.
I'd go so far as to say you could put, I wouldn't say any high school football player of today, but like a senior. I'm just talking size wise. I'm not talking prodigy or like, whatever. But like a senior football player who has all that experience behind them and is like at least sizable. I bet you they could still also dog walk back then.
So yeah, that's absolute legend John Heisman. What are your thoughts on this guy?
He's at an absolute legitimate the internet likes to make Giga Chads into. He's like an actual Giga Chad.
An actual Giga Chad.
Before we go, what are your sources, Derek?
Well, real quick, are you surprised that we actually got, were you actually, I know you weren't expecting a whole lot from a sports story, but were you entertained by this?
Oh, fuck yes. I'm genuinely shocked at how much depth. Like, this was perfectly on spot for our shit. And I was like, I don't know how well this is going to fit in at first. And then you come in with this, like, holy shit, he perfectly fits our mold and all that. And like, hell yeah, you did great with this one.
Yeah. Oh, fuck. Incredible story. So yeah, my socials, I'm on Twitter at Visigot, the first I as a one.
I said your sources. You haven't given us your source yet.
Oh shit, yeah, my sources. My main source is Heisman, the man behind the trophy it's by John M. Heisman, who is this Heisman's great nephew.
Okay.
So John M. Heisman and Mark Schlabach. That was the main source I used. I also took a bit from it's a series on YouTube called Pretty Good. It's put out by a channel called Secret Base, who did a whole episode on the Georgia Tech Cumberland 1916 game. And oh boy. If you want to check out that video, it goes into a lot more detail than I did, and it's so fucking funny. So yeah, those were my main sources. Want me to go ahead and do?
Yeah, go ahead and give us your socials.
Okay, yeah, my socials are I'm on Twitter at Visigot, the first I is a 1, the O is a 0. I'm on Blue Sky at Visigot, the first I is a regular I, and the O is a 0. Anyways, Tim, give them the business.
So they can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Tim, a.k.a. Otis, and they can find us at the podcast at the Alexander Society Pod on Facebook and Instagram, Alex Society Pod on Twitter and Blue Sky, and Alexander Society on TikTok. And if they've enjoyed us, we hope they can give us a rate and review on their streaming platform of choice, and we will see them next time.
Bye.